Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us for our webinar on the cannabis sector and indigenous nations. My name is Jeremy Burke. I'm a partner at Airden Burles here, and I'm joined by Andrew Ross of Cannabis Compliance Inc. and Kim Thomas, who's affiliated with Airden Burles and operates her own practice as well. I'll give you a quick bios on myself and Kim and Andrew, and then we'll get started into the substance of the webinar. I've been told to let you know that you can ask questions during the webinar while we're live. I think it's in the bottom corner, one corner of your screen. Feel free to put questions to us, and we'll do our best to get to them at the end if we have time. So very quickly, I'm a partner here and a member of the Airden Burles Corporate Commercial and Cannabis Groups. My practice focuses on mergers and acquisitions, as well as corporate structuring and governance and various types of commercial agreements and business ownership arrangements, a broad corporate commercial practice. My regulatory practice includes advising public and private companies in a variety of industries, primarily cannabis, but also transportation and franchising, and some in not-for-profit and charity law. My cannabis experience includes working with participants really in all corners of the cannabis industry: federal licensed producers and applicants, provincial cannabis retail store operators, Canadian and international branding companies, testing companies, equipment and packaging suppliers, food and beverage companies, not-for-profits, as well as some Indigenous First Nations and organizations seeking to work with them. So Andrew is a business development consultant with Cannabis Compliance Inc. Andrew has a deep understanding of the Cannabis Act regulations and extensive experience working with the ACMPR, the predecessor to the Cannabis Act. With over a decade of consultative security system design and project management experience, Andrew has worked on system designs and implementation for large-scale projects varying from licensed medical cannabis facilities to federal and provincial correctional facilities and healthcare sites. Andrew's completed the security implementation for Canadian medical cannabis licensed producer Organogram. That was between 2011 and 2012, and has since been focused on the cannabis industry. Kim Thomas is a proud citizen of the Seneca First Nation, Bear Clan, and an experienced corporate lawyer. Kim was fortunate to be raised with her culture and traditions at Six Nations of the Grand River Territory, which allows her to bring a culturally sensitive and critical perspective to the practice of law. Kim really began her legal career with Airden Burles before successfully founding her own law firm at Six Nations of the Grand River. As Kim's practice has grown, she's renewed her connection with A&B as affiliated independent counsel, and Kim, we're very happy to have you back with us. Her unique role here allows her to support her client base with a full-service law firm while assisting her clients to strengthen and build their nations through the development of nation-based economies that are respectful of their cultural values. So that was sort of the introduction, and I guess I have the honor of covering the first and probably most boring section of the cannabis webinar, but stay tuned. There's more interesting things to come later. We thought it would make sense to start with really an overview of the cannabis regulatory framework, just so everybody's on the same page as we go through the rest of the presentation. So the Cannabis Act is a federal act that came into force October 17, 2018, and was just amended last week to permit edibles, extracts, and topicals, as most people probably know. The federal act regulates pretty much everything about the production of cannabis, also its permitted forms, packaging and labeling requirements, consistencies, potencies, composition, consistencies, seed-to-sale tracking, and also promotion and marketing of cannabis products, and the sale of medical cannabis. The sale of recreational cannabis is governed provincially. We'll cover that in a little bit. The federal statute establishes criminal penalties for a number of offenses, including relating to unlicensed production and improper possession, distribution, or sale. The federal statute has an express delegation of authority to the provinces and territories for the distribution of recreational cannabis. And notably, the federal statute has no reference at all to First Nations. There are 6 license types that you can apply for under the federal statute: cultivation, growing cannabis; processing, which essentially means producing cannabis by any means other than cultivation; a license for medical sale; analytical testing, research; and a cannabis drug license. A cannabis drug is essentially just like any other cannabis product, except it's made with therapeutic claims. And if you want to make therapeutic claims, you have to have a cannabis drug license as well as a drug establishment license. So it's really an RX. It's for pharmaceuticals, essentially. So that's at the federal level. Dropping down to the provincial level, so as I mentioned, the provincial governments have the authority to regulate the distribution and sale of recreational cannabis in their province. And the provincial statutes regulate a number of other things, including transportation, places of consumption, minimum age of consumption. Certain provinces have raised the 18-year-old minimum age established in the Federal Act to make it higher. Making it lower would be a problem, but none of the provinces have tried to do that. In Ontario, the key statutes are the Cannabis License Act and the Cannabis Control Act. They regulate retail store licensing and compliance, as well as permitted use, places of consumption, things like that. At the provincial level, there's often, in terms of smokables, there's often specific legislation that regulates where you're permitted to smoke or vape, and that would include smoking or vape in cannabis, as well as tobacco or other products. So in Ontario, licensing is managed by the AGCO, the Alcohol and Gaming Commission, and they issue licenses to retail stores and manage ongoing compliance as well. The Ontario legislation does expressly contemplate side agreements with First Nations. Section 43 that you see up on the screen there, that actually gives band councils the ability to tell the registrar, the AGCO registrar, not to issue licenses for any stores on their reserve. And then Section 44 contemplates side agreements. So what these side agreements, if they were utilized, would allow First Nations to do under the provincial statute is essentially enter into a parallel licensing regime to the licensing regime that exists off reserve. There's a similar provision in the Cannabis Control Act, which is on the next slide there, allowing the Crown to enter into side agreements with Band Council with respect to the sale, distribution, purchase, possession, consumption, cultivation, propagation, or harvesting of cannabis on a reserve, which is interesting, in particular, not just for jurisdiction-related issues with First Nations, but also federal versus provincial jurisdiction issues, because cultivation is federally regulated. So this contemplates a parallel regime on First Nations that would be, in theory, provincially regulated. I haven't worked on a file that involves that issue specifically, so I'm not sure how that would play out, but interesting to note. So that's sort of the basics of the regulatory regime, and at this point I'm going to turn it over to Kim Thomas.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. Good afternoon, Nyawiskano, Swagwego, Sego. Good afternoon, Ani Boju. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks to everyone for participating and joining us this afternoon. I am going to talk about the jurisdictional concerns in relation to the existing federal and provincial statutes concerning the cannabis industry. Of particular concern in my practice, and with that of many of my clients, is arguably the federal and provincial governments have failed in meeting their fiduciary obligations and the honor that they owe to Indigenous peoples, a right that is constitutionally protected in Section 35, as there has been minimal consultation with First Nations, in my opinion, prior to the enactment of both the federal and provincial legislations regulating the industry. And often what is forgotten when you look at laws and the conflict of laws is that there is a third order of government, and that is the inherent right to regulate and govern our own affairs as Indigenous people in this country. Many of the treaty rights and the Aboriginal rights that exist with Indigenous people predates the formation of Canada. So when you look at the Section 35 case law, it's arguable whether that regime in itself is really accurate, if you will, when you're looking at an entirely different legal system and colonial regime than that which existed pre-contact. So many Indigenous nations will look instead to international law, and in particular the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, or UNDRIP as it's called. If you look at UNDRIP, it actually says that to regulate any sort of commercial activity on Indigenous territory, you actually need to obtain the free, prior, and informed consent of that nation prior to taking action. When you contrast that to the Section 35 case law, however, what the courts have set up is a spectrum of consultation, accommodation, and at the far right of the spectrum is the requirement to obtain consent. So it's a spectrum of engagement that is dependent on the degree of infringement, which the end result has been very costly litigation under Section 35, which often does not, unfortunately, serve many Indigenous nations at the community level. So when we now look at the Cannabis Act, both federally as well as the provincial regulations that Jeremy spoke about, we see, in my opinion, that it is very short-sighted, as it has not taken into account issues that are of importance to Indigenous nations that are very culturally specific. In particular, land use issues, environmental issues, zoning issues, as well as cultural beliefs and practices, which differ across nations. And that's probably one of the most important things that I'd like to reiterate for this webinar, is that you can't have a cookie-cutter one-size-fits-all, because each Indigenous nation across this country is completely different. And within each individual nation, there is a variety of belief systems and cultural practices. So when you're looking even at the community level for those nations that are seeking to self-regulate, in my opinion, it's incumbent on them to also ensure that there's proper community engagement, to ensure that that legislation that they're seeking to regulate under their own jurisdiction adequately reflects the desires and beliefs of the people they're seeking to regulate. So it actually, in my opinion, begs the question whether the provincial and federal legislation is in fact applicable to Indigenous nations who choose to participate in the cannabis industry on their territories. If there has not been meaningful consultation and the degree of infringement is so severe that their rights are impacted, and I cannot think of an industry where that could not be more true. When you look at some of the health and safety issues, the environmental issues, the commercial issues, there's huge impact at the community level that the cannabis industry is going to have. And for the federal and provincial government not to have done its homework and engaged in meaningful consultation is just incredibly short-sighted. And I noticed many of the questions that have come in to date so far for the webinar. Unfortunately, it means that we're operating in a very gray space. So with that said, and again, as I mentioned, because many Indigenous nations, they want more certainty, especially if they're looking at partnering with third-party proponents. They may choose to participate within the existing federal and provincial regime in the normal course. And Andrew is actually going to talk about that in a bit, because that's certainly an option, and Jeremy talked about that as well, in terms of carving out a space, whether it's provincially, or going through the federal licensing if you want to be a licensed producer and obtaining a license under that regime. And I know there will be those nations who are adamant in their resistance that this is legislation that does not apply to us, nor should it apply to us, that it's a breach of our inherent Aboriginal and treaty rights, and will choose to self-regulate. And in particular, many Indigenous nations will be completely opposed to any sort of provincial jurisdiction being applied on traditional territories, whether that's reserve lands or Aboriginal and treaty rights territories. That also brings up, if you're choosing to regulation, is how do you, to self-regulate, is how do you mitigate that risk? In particular, in terms of health and safety, enforcement issues, and what happens if that legislation is challenged, if criminal charges are brought because arguably you're operating under self-regulation, which has not been recognized. So those First Nations that choose to self-regulate have to be prepared to defend a constitutional challenge, to defend criminal charges, if someone is participating in the cannabis industry under a self-regulated regime. With that said, there's also options to negotiate with the federal government and or provincial government, depending on the views of the First Nation, to establish a protocol, if you will, in terms of how the regulation is going to happen on territory.
And Kim, do you agree that it would be useful for that purpose for any self-regulation to sort of try to adhere to the public policy principles of the federal legislation, public health policy in particular?
Absolutely. When we talk about harmonization of laws, we're looking at the federal and provincial laws. And in my opinion, that should be the floor, not the ceiling, because there are unique perspectives that as Indigenous people, we can offer to the industry. I mean, I have seen firsthand and experienced some of the environmental effects from the licensed producers. And there is advanced technology that is being used in Colorado in terms of air scrubbers for those licensed producers to ensure that you're not emitting the smell that many are complaining about, or the pollen emissions. And so Indigenous people have a chance to be stewards of the environment and do better than what is currently existing in the regulations in terms of health and safety and environmental issues. So I'm just going to now focus on actual participation where you've got mixed ownership. If you've got third-party proponents that are not Indigenous, that are seeking to do business with First Nations, there are some corporate structures and taxation issues that you have to be mindful of. Depending on the First Nation, for those that are still regulated through the Indian Act, under Section 87 of the Indian Act, First Nations are exempt from taxation. So when I'm providing corporate advice, obviously First Nations want to ensure that their tax planning is in place where their exemption is preserved to the greatest extent possible. So when you've got a non-status proponent that is seeking to do business with a First Nation, you have to look at the corporate structure that is chosen, as the tax treatment is going to vary. So when you've got mixed ownership, I always recommend either a limited partnership, a general partnership, or a joint venture. The reason for this is that the First Nation can continue to earn their profits tax-free, whereas the non-status partner would pay tax in the normal course. If the parties were to form a corporation, any profits distributed would be after-tax income. So that would not be favorable to the First Nation. And I did talk about harmonization and some environmental and land use issues. So I'm just going to close my portion by talking about reserve lands. And you have to be mindful, again, where you've got mixed ownership, because there's very specific provisions in the Indian Act regarding leasing of reserve lands. What it says in the Indian Act, in short, is that if you're not a status Indian, you could be subject to trespass if you're located on a reserve. And failing that, you have to ensure that you have a proper lease under the Indian Act, and there are various leasing provisions set out in the Indian Act. And again, this is not across the board, because there's First Nations that do have land codes, and so they are under a different process. There's First Nations that have self-government agreements, and they, again, are under a different process. So again, as part of due diligence, it's incumbent on proponents to look at what are the land use regulations that would apply to your proposed project. And there are also First Nations, even though they are under the Indian Act, they establish leases, which are known as Bakshi leases. These are not regulated by Indigenous Affairs. Indigenous Affairs knows that these leases exist, and as long as the First Nation is not taking issue with it, it's not a problem. But again, if you want the certainty, if you're a proponent that's external, you want to make sure that your ability to situate your project on reserve is validly supported, whether that's through the government or the appropriate regime in place. When I say government, I mean the First Nations government. Thank you.
Thanks, Kim. Andrew.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for making this webinar a part of your afternoon. Genuinely hope that this helps maybe answer some questions, maybe bring up some new questions, and I really hope it helps fuel a much larger discussion. What I'm here to talk about primarily are the two pathways that exist for an Indigenous nation to apply for a cannabis license. In the next couple slides, I'm going to be speaking to the specifics of the steps you'll take to get towards being able to submit a license. So to go through those very quickly here, step one is obviously finding a property or building that's suitable for the long-term vision. Really long-term vision is finding a building that's suitable for the expansion of your business. If you're looking to be, 100,000 square feet on one day, you don't want to lock yourself into a 10,000 square foot building with no ability to expand. And some key criteria to consider during this search is if you are on non-Indigenous land, you will need to have municipal approval. The municipality will have to approve your cannabis activities. If it's on Indigenous land, it is a little bit different than going through municipality, but I do believe there's still a band council resolution required. Some big items to consider for your building or for the property is sufficient electrical and water supply. The timeline for this is quite variable. Sometimes it's easy to come across the ideal property, and sometimes it can take a few months. Step two, once the property or building has been secured, it's really the time to engage a consultant team to commence facility and planning phase along with your business plan development. This part itself can take between 60 to 75 days, depending on the intricacy of your business. From that point, we're moving those conceptual floor plans into what we'll call a construction phase. Looking to secure a contractor, a security integrator, electricians, any of the trades needed to execute the construction of that project. See, we do offer at CCI the ability to facilitate introductions to these trades, as well as offering some vendor support, vendor vetting, and build-out support. Once you do have a builder and your trade selected, the construction or retrofit phase is really in full swing. We can offer a build-out support package, as previously mentioned. It just ensures that your builders are using all compliant materials, and you'll end up with no surprises in the end. Typical construction for a project like this can range between 4 to 12 months, and is largely dependent on the builder you've selected, as well as the complexity of the project you're building out. Again, to beat a dead horse, we can offer you some support in going through this, but really once you get through to the end of the construction of your project, This is where the evidence package or video attestation phase comes into play. So we can come in and film the evidence package, bringing in all of the security documentation and reporting that completes the evidence package. This acts as a virtual site audit for Health Canada. So back in the earlier days of the ACMPR, Health Canada actually would send agents to site to conduct their initial audit. Well, because there are so many license holders and applicants now, they just don't have the manpower to send people out anymore. So these video attestations act as their initial site walk, if you will, of your facility. So the evidence package itself takes about 2 days to compile all the information and about 2 weeks to complete. So at this point, you're ready to submit a complete application paired with an evidence package to begin what we call our 90-day timer for Health Canada's turnaround of that application. So what we see now is those 7 steps led us to step 1 of the application process. So what we're looking at right now is all the existing regulatory pathway. So there are 2 pathways for submission for an Indigenous application, and this one being the one that's in existence for the general populace. I will discuss the Navigator program after this. So the first 7 steps got us to a point where we can submit our application and our evidence package. So prior to May 8th, the method in which you would submit an application was much different, and I will touch on that in a moment. But this is great news to have your application and evidence package. Once you submit that, Health Canada has finally given us a timeline for approval of these applications. Prior to May 8th, this timeline did not exist, and it's not unlike that. We've heard a lot of crazy stories of people being in queue with their license for several years, and I'll speak to the reason for that in a little bit. But this is really good. So the 90-day turnaround, we've got 30 days screening of your application. It's a high-level overview before the 60-day active review starts. At this point, active review is exactly as it sounds. You'll have an agent dedicated to your file actively reviewing the information that you've submitted. Any point after that active review starts, you can expect to receive requests for information or RFIs. With really Health Canada looking and digging deeper into what you've submitted, where they're just trying to find more information, maybe getting some clarification on some items. Once they're content and happy with what they've seen through the answers in those RFIs, they will issue you your license. Now, this infograph is very specific post step 3 towards the pursuance of a cultivation and processing license. So I'll quickly just go through those steps as well. Post the issuance of license, you can expect Health Canada to show up for an audit pretty much any time after you are operational. Sometimes they do not give you any heads up, so expect them to be there at any time. So moving into the commercialization of your product, this is where we're getting very specific to the processing license at step 4. So I'll move through these parts a little bit fast. In order to get product to market as a processor, you're cultivating cannabis, you're processing cannabis, prior to achieving a sales license itself, you are able to sell business to business. So if you're cultivating or processing a product, you can sell that to another license holder and have them route it to market for you when you do not have your 2-batch amendment and sales license in place. In order to sell to the customer or to the end user, or to establish the ability to move your product into any of the governing bodies overseeing retail in all provinces, or moving product direct to through a federal medical sales license, these steps would have to be taken in order to get your product out. I'm going to spare the details of how to get through the 2-batch amendment. This was just a great run through of how in depth a lot of this process can be. So the alternative method in which you can apply is through the Navigator program. So prior to May 8th, the method in which you would apply was you would complete an application in its entirety, floor plan, security plan, SOPs, personal disclosure information, the whole list of deliverables. You complete the application and then you submit it into the CTLS. Through the Navigator program, backtrack. The old way was you would submit the application into the CTLS or into Health Canada, and it would kind of go into a holding queue. There's no real answer I've been able to get that really clarifies how that queue worked, but really what it would amount to is an undisclosed amount of time before your application would get picked up and be reviewed. So this was prior to May 8th. What actually they ended up finding out through this process over the years was, as Health Canada was issuing confirmation of readiness letters to these applicants, the confirmation of readiness letter is really geared towards triggering the applicant to send back an evidence package to show Health Canada they have done everything they said they were going to do. Well, 70% of those confirmation of readiness letters did not receive a response. So that's why Health Canada changed their methodology to help streamline this. That's where we got the 90-day turnaround, because now, through the existing pathway post-May 8th, we have to submit our application along with our evidence package to show Health Canada we are completely built out. The Navigator program itself follows the old methodology. It does allow Indigenous groups to put together and submit an application without having their facility built out. One of the potential downsides to this is submitting an application without knowing what the timeline for review will be does create a lot of uncertainty in a business. The other problem potentially with it is, we know the timeline with the new submission method. We know that we can control that timeline. Whereas with the Navigator program, we haven't necessarily seen the timelines follow suit with the new structure. So with the Navigator program, if you do submit in this method, it will get submitted or held over to a dedicated professional at Health Canada who's very knowledgeable in Indigenous projects, priorities, communities, and circumstances. They will help move that application along, but it does still follow the old method. And if you do submit an application today and you do start to go through your build-out phase, there's a lot of times when those build-out, like the build-out itself or the floor plan will change as you're going through construction. And the issue with the old method comes in the fact that if you do start to make any changes to those floor plans sort of on the fly as you're building, it is a required amendment to go back to Health Canada to be re-reviewed and can add some substantial time to the review period. So you do have two opportunities to apply. I can't say which one is better than the other, but you would have two opportunities to take advantage of, either going through the existing regulatory pathway or looking to leverage the Navigator program. So as a recap, you'll see a lot of what I've said through the pathway to licensing sort of re-encompassed here in year one and year two. And the reason I wanted to bring this slide up more than anything was just to highlight, I mean, this really could show year 1 through year 10. These projects do take some time to unfold properly. And I just wanted to highlight, the importance of taking your time moving through this. Everyone is always in a rush to get to the end, and, a well thought out plan will get a well thought out product. So, year 1 will encompass what I've mentioned through those first 7 steps, as well as the next 4. Post that to get yourself licensed. It is possible with this climate we have now for applications to get approved within a year, whereas prior to May 8th, it would have been very difficult to say that. We see year 2 getting into operational readiness and really startup operations and moving into really getting your feet wet and starting to expand your business. Year 3 is really where we start to see a lot of increased capacity, regardless of what license you're speaking about, and the ability to offer into new products as well.
Thanks, Andrew. So that takes us to the end of our pre-prepared portion of the webinar. So we've received several questions both before and some during the presentation, so thank you for submitting those. I've tried to sort of group them into like areas, and I thought maybe I'd start with, we received a few questions about financing, opportunities and challenges for First Nations in accessing capital to undertake projects. Kim, is that something you can?
Sure, I can address that question. There are a few hurdles that you would have to overcome if you're looking at financing for a First Nation. Fortunately, with advances in the banking industry, many of these have been overcome, but it is sourced in Section 89 of the Indian Act, which is a provision which prevents the seizure of on-reserve assets if there was to be a default on a loan. That used to preclude many large-scale developments on reserve because banks were just very nervous to finance any type of on-reserve development because of Section 89. However, with advances in own source revenue, several successful ventures across the country, banks have slowly come on board, and I would say to the point now that many First Nations have been able to overcome this hurdle with the financing industry, and many banks are actually competing with First Nations to finance their projects. That's with the banking sector. There's also monies available through various federal programs. It used to be known as Aboriginal Business Canada, I believe now known as Aboriginal Business and Entrepreneurial Development, and there are various procurement programs as well that the federal government has in place, all to encourage Indigenous economies.
Thank you. Andrew, there's a couple of questions here about the import and export of cannabis. One is, do you see Indigenous nations being able to import cannabis products from recognized Canadian trading partners? I assume that means international trading partners. And the other is similar, importation and exportation restrictions between Canada and the Caribbean and Latin American jurisdictions. Do you want to talk about the international treaties that we're subject to?
Yeah, sure. So as far as importing product from any other country at this point, when you read into the cannabis regulations, it says specifically that the importation of product can be done for research and development purposes or for medical purposes. To date, we've only seen any import permit get approved for research and development purposes only.
And I'll just jump in quickly. That restriction is in the Cannabis Act because it's because of the 1961-1971 international UN treaties that prohibit any country that's signed on from importing or exporting cannabis for any reason other than medical or scientific purposes.
Yeah, so even with the term medical purposes, it's a little bit deceiving the way it's worded because it makes it sound like you could import product for medical purposes, aka bringing in crude oil and processing it to get to a finished product for a patient. But we have not seen any permits for those get approved. And
that's because Health Canada's current policy is to narrow that even further than it is already, except in certain.
I really think it's geared towards trying to ensure that any product that's going out to end users in the country is manufactured in the country. That seems to be the way it's worked out so far. We haven't seen any commercialization of any products that come from outside the country to date.
Thank you. Kim, maybe this one for you. There's a question, who writes, establishes, and enforces laws on a First Nation when there's limited police support?
That is always a huge challenge. And policing works differently, depending on the First Nation. Many have tripartite agreements with the RCMP, the provincial police, and the reserve police force, if there is a reserve police force. In terms of writing and establishing the laws, that is at the direction of the First Nation. For example, if we're talking about self-regulation, then it would be the First Nation government that would be enacting the legislation and implementing the legislation. It would then be incumbent on that First Nation to work with their local police force regarding enforcement. I had another question that came in about providing concrete examples. And because it's a new industry, it's difficult to know the way this is going to play out. So I think we can learn a lot instead from the tobacco industry. And many of my clients have talked about the lessons that have been learned from the tobacco industry on reserve and wanting to make sure that they get ahead of that with the cannabis industry. With tobacco, it ended up culminating in Bill C-10, which basically criminalized the tobacco industry for anyone that was participating in the tobacco industry on reserve without a manufacturing license. So it divided the market between stamped cigarettes and unstamped cigarettes. Now, when you look at enforcement, the enforcement, certainly in my experience, has been very minimal of Bill C-10 on reserve. And again, many First Nations have taken the position that they have an inherent right to regulate and the tobacco industry, again, from seed to sale. And there are those First Nations who have been able to pass legislation and implement legislation and get buy-in, if you will, from the police force. I can also draw on my experience with New York State, because we did draft tobacco law there and had import and export laws and stamped the tobacco ourselves. So that was actually implemented, and we did fight back against the state and the federal government in the U.S. to ensure that the law was respected. So in terms of the cannabis industry, those will be the same hurdles that First Nations are looking at, is enforcement. And I do note that there was another question that came in about whether or not Canada and Ontario would recognize the Six Nations Cannabis Control Law passed in 2018, and that's currently being implemented. And again, that goes back to my earlier point where I talked about harmonization and I talked about negotiation versus litigation. Anytime you litigate these matters, it's very costly for people on both sides. The government has recognized that. First Nations certainly recognize that. So I'm always a proponent of negotiation where possible. I look at some of the gaming compacts again with our sister communities in the U.S. Some may not be fans of the state compacts that have had to be negotiated, but it did create economic certainty because you carved up the pie, so to speak. So the regulation was respected, the law was respected, but you did have to turn over a percentage of the revenue to the state. That's a hard sell with many Indigenous nations in Canada, especially where there's unresolved land claims of substantial dollars that remain outstanding. It's a hard sell to say we're willing to carve up the pie when there's a huge deficit on the other side.
Thank you. Andrew, there's a question here about options being explored for green extraction solutions. A little bit of a technical question, but
a technical question with an easy answer. There certainly are. There is a license holder, if not two right now, that are using cold water extraction instead of using solvents. We also see solventless options being regulated in the recent implementation of what we're calling Cannabis 2.0. So items like rosin, which are just essentially pressing the matter out of the flower, those are allowed to be into the market now, or will be after the 60-day hold period in December. So the answer is yes, there are green solutions for extractions, and the two that would be most common right now would be cold water and rosin, which is basically just a heat press.
Thank you. So we've just received a further small batch of questions. Let me just go through these quickly. Andrew, that third one down here, is that something you're comfortable speaking to?
So let me read it here.
Oh, actually, I guess it's sort of the same answer. It's a question about how exporting works, opposite importing. So it's essentially the same. In order to export cannabis from Canada, Health Canada will require you, the license holder, to receive an export permit. And the only way you get an export permit is if you can prove that it's legal to import it into the country you're seeking to export to.
Mm-hmm. So I honestly have more experience with the EU import and export.
Mm-hmm.
That's
Latin
America, I don't have a whole lot of experience.
It would sort of be the same, I guess.
I'm assuming it would follow suit.
Yeah.
I mean, if cannabis is regulated legal at the federal level in whatever that country is, I mean, you'd have to have the import permit at the other end approved as well. So right. It's a multifaceted venture. So, I mean, as long as the country at the other end is able to approve that import permit, again, I don't know what the regulations would be at the other end, but there would be a possibility.
Kim, there's a question here. Thank you, Andrew. A question here, Kim, about training and education for First Nations on cannabis. Are you aware of any partnerships or programs that deal with that?
Not that I'm aware of. I know that the Assembly of First Nations recently held a conference on the cannabis industry in particular, which was pretty well attended, as I understand, from First Nations across the country. I think if any particular First Nation was looking to receive more education and awareness, that there are certainly those consultants, such as Andrew, that are willing to go into communities to explain the industry in particular. Certainly, people like myself and Jeremy, from a legal standpoint, are available to provide training and awareness about what's happening in the industry and what the options are for participation, whether you want to participate in the regular regime or through inherent rights.
Kim, thank you very much. I think that brings us to the end of our webinar, a few minutes early, but I think that was very informative. Andrew and Kim, thank you very much for your time, and I hope everybody listening had an interesting session. Please feel free to follow up with further questions, and I think, Kim, you have... I'm missing something here. I'm getting a sign.
I'm just going to do a wrap-up and a summary.
Thank you.
So again, just to thank everyone for tuning in and for participating. It's been very knowledgeable. Thank you to Andrew for joining us from a regulatory standpoint, and Jeremy, of course. And as Jeremy mentioned, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to contact us by phone or by email. For those who are participating, you will be receiving an email in the next few weeks along with a copy of the presentation and an audio recording. So with that, thanks everyone for your participation this afternoon.